Okay, hello. This video is about factoring by grouping. So now we are going to do the opposite of what happens when we FOIL. We want to go back the other way. And so this one is a special technique. This one only happens when we have 4 terms. So that's kind of when we know when to use it, is if we have 4 terms. We usually want to try factoring by grouping. So let's look at some examples at how we factor by grouping. So our first example, Jm plus Jn plus Km plus Kn. All right, so what we want to do is look to see if we can put parentheses around anything that allows us to group them in such a way. So if I were to put parentheses around them like this, if each group has something in common, a GCF, a greatest common factor I can pull out of each one. So let's look at the first group with the J's. So in this case, Jm plus Jn, we see that each term, so there's 2 terms in here, each term has a J. So we can factor out a J from that first group. And then if I pull a J from the Jm, M is left. If I pull a J from the Jn, N is left. Now let's look at the second group. So we want to look at both terms and we want to say what is common. So in both of these terms, they each have a K. So we want to go ahead and pull that K out, factor it out. And if I pull a K from the Km, M is left. If I pull a K from the Kn, N is left. Now, we're successful in that part. Now what we want to do is look at this overall picture. And we want to say what is common out of the whole picture. And what we see is that the thing in the parentheses, this right here, is what's common out of the whole thing. So if I pull an M plus N group out of there, if I pull it from the first one, what is left over? I have a J left over. And if I pull an M plus N out of the second group, I have a K left over. So this guy and this guy are what's left. And so now we have factored this. This becomes M plus N times J plus K. And if we were to go ahead and FOIL this answer that we have found, we would end up right back at the beginning. So we would know that we factored it correctly. All right, let's look at the next example. We have Mn minus 4m minus 5n plus 20. Okay, so again, we want to group these in such a way that they have something in common that we can pull out of there. And I'll tell you at the beginning, this one has a little trick to it. So if we look at the first group, we can see that there's an M in common. If I pull an M from Mn, we're left with N. If I pull an M from 4m, I'm left with the 4. So I have N minus 4 in the parentheses. In the second group, between 5n and 20, we realized that we could pull a 5 out of there. So I'm going to pull a 5 from there. If I pull a 5 from the 5n, I'm left with n. If I pull a 5 from the 20, I'm left with 4. So we think, oh my goodness, we're in the clear, it looks good. But if I look at this, I have n minus 4 and n plus 4, and those are not the same. So here's where that little trick comes in handy. what we have to do is when we pull this 5 out of there, we're actually pulling a negative 5. So even though this minus looks like it's minus 5, we're going to pull out a negative 5. And the reason for that is because if I pull a negative 5 from here, so let me back up. Let me erase some of this so you can see what's happening. Okay, so in this one, what happens is I want to group it more like this. And so what happens is I want to take out a negative 5, because if I pull a negative 5 from this term, I'm left with a positive n. But if I pull a negative 5 from this term, it's a negative 4. 20 divided by negative 5 is a negative 4. Now they're the same. So now when I go to group them differently, what's going to happen is I see that they have n minus 4 in common, and what is left over is m minus 5. And there's our answer. We have now factored this. All right, let's look at one more example together. So we have y squared plus 10z minus 10y minus yz. All right, this one has a little trick to it as well, but let's take a look. If I group them the way I did on the last two, and I look at the first group, I have to ask myself, is there anything common out of that group that I can pull out of there? And I look at y squared and I look at 10z and I realize there's nothing in common there. So I can't group them this way. So what has to happen is I have to group them differently. But how does one do that? So I have to erase this so we can see what's going on. I have to rearrange them. So what happens is I have to kind of move them around, which is totally fair to do, but I have to remember to take the sign with it. So I can group them a couple different ways. I can see that if I group these two together and these two together, I could pull y's and z's out of there. I might have grouped them a little different, where I grouped these two together and these two together because I saw that the y squared and the yz have a y, but that the two middle terms have a 10. Either way is totally fine. So I'm going to write them so that it goes in the direction, and I group the ones that I want to group together. 10y, and then I'm going to do plus 10z minus yz. So I've rearranged them. Notice I took the sign with it. So the minus 10y has a minus 10y. The plus 10z has a plus in front of it. I can rearrange anything as long as I take the sign with it. So now I want to group them. And now the first group has a y that's common. And so if I pull a y from y squared, I'm left with y. If I pull a y from 10y, I'm left with 10. The second group, I'm going to pull out a z. And so then if I pull a z from 10z, I'm left with 10. If I pull a z from yz, I'm left with y. Now, what do we notice? Very interesting thing happened. I have y minus 10, 10 minus y. We are so close. So what happens is, it doesn't matter which group, but I have to pull out a negative 1. So if I pull a negative 1 from this group here, what happens is now this becomes negative and that becomes positive. Now you might not see it at first, so I'm going to keep the negative y there, But if I rearrange it like I did before, I have a positive 10, a minus y, if I rearrange it, plus z times 10 minus y. And now they match. And so now we can pull them out as a group. And so our first group is 10 minus y. And then we ask ourselves, well, what's left over? And I don't really want to start with a negative, so I'm going to say z minus y, just so it looks prettier. Okay, and so that's our answer, 10 minus y times z minus y. Now, what if I wrote it the other way? Z minus y times 10 minus y? There's no big difference. I can write them either direction because, remember, multiplication is commutative. I can write them in any order. So I hope this helps in your lesson. Again, this lesson is factoring by grouping. If you have questions, please ask as you work through your lesson, but I hope these do help as you work along. Thanks.